I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, I am chatting with Kate Quinn. Kate is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of historical fiction. A native of Southern California, she attended Boston University, where she earned a bachelor's and master's degree in classical voice. Her latest novel, The Briar Club, is a haunting and powerful story of female friendships and secrets in a Washington, D.C. boarding house during the McCarthy era, and it was released yesterday. I am so excited to have her on the show today. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yes, we have, as I was mentioning to you earlier, many historical fiction fans on the show. So I am beyond excited to have you on here today. But let's start with, can you tell us a little bit about who you are? I feel like you're so much more than this bio here.
Well, as I said, I'm a California girl. I spent a lot of time in Boston, so I'm a California girl who is a Red Sox fan. That was where I went to school. And I am sort of the product of what happens when you have a father who's a professional but classically trained jazz musician and a mother who's a history buff and a librarian. I grew up very much immersed in books and music, and I really ended up going in for both in a big way. I trained as an opera singer, but at the same time, I was always writing books in the background. It was been what I've been doing just for fun since I've literally been 10 years old. I have had book projects going. And so even though, I was learning my arias and my scales, I was also writing books on the side. And eventually at some point, it was after graduate school, I was querying literary agents, and a book that I wrote my freshman year of school at Boston University, when I was looking to escape a Boston winter by any means necessary, and I escaped instead into first century imperial Rome. That book got picked up by a literary agent who then sold it that same year, and that became my very first published novel, Mistress of Rome. So the books won out over the music, although I do still sing in the car, and I sing when I'm baking.
I was going to ask you that, so that's perfect.
Oh, I sing. You should hear me sing along to Hamilton in the car. I've got the whole flow Unsatisfied, absolutely ripping it out as I'm, going down the 405. But
that sounds amazing.
But writing is something I've done, for a very long time. And if I were not lucky enough to be a published author, I would still be writing books. It's just that I would be putting them in drawers when I was done.
I've had other authors come on and talk about their books under the bed, or, stashed somewhere, like one day. Maybe that'll be a one day.
Oh, I have books under the bed, but they're never coming out from under the bed. These are the books that are so bad, they will never see the light of day. And that's okay, because those are the books where I was teaching myself how to be a writer. I mean, I'm largely self-taught, and that meant that I learned how to do this by doing a lot of reading and a lot of writing. And that means that I have a lot of very bad books that are under the bed, but that's okay. It's all part of the process.
Yeah, I imagine that it's just honing your craft along the way each time you do it. So it just gets better and better. With your latest novel, we have The Briar Club coming out. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what it is about?
Well, The Briar Club is, in a nutshell, a book about a house full of very different women who all live in a 1950s all-female boarding house in Washington, D.C. during the height of the McCarthy era, when also, the Cold War is booming, Russia is the enemy, the nuclear race is going, and, the world is, pulling away from, the World War II haunted era of the 1940s, but it hasn't yet hit the era of social change that the 60s are going to be notable for. And that's an era with a lot going on under the surface. And I thought it was just a great way to examine how a house full of women have their varying experiences of what it is like to be a woman in America in that time. They start out when they are all sort of ships that pass in the night. They live in the same house, but they don't know each other. But then at the very beginning of the book, a new boarder moves in, a mysterious widow from the Midwest who comes in and lives in the attic room. And she starts to pull her housemates together with a weekly supper club and cups of sun tea that she brews on her windowsill. And before they know it, they realize that they have more to offer each other in friendship and support than they thought. But the fact is also that they all have secrets, and some of those secrets are going to prove deadly.
Oh, okay. All right. I am so intrigued. I can't wait to pick this one up. And I can tell I've fallen into all of your novels, and even starting with Mistress of Rome. We were stationed overseas in Italy, so I was trying to read all these Italy-centric books, and but the amount of research that you do, it must be quite extensive that you put in your novels, and I always find it so impressive how you can make it into this fantastic story, and I'm learning so much when I read your books. So can you tell us about your research process for them?
Well, my research really goes on before, during, and after the drafting of a book. It really goes on through the entire thing. And for this particular book, I really tried to look at this as, because there's a lot of women in this book and a lot of different points of view. You're going to hear each woman's story as she lives it. And I wanted to look at, sort of a microcosm of life in America during the early 50s. And so each woman is a way to examine something different about the 1950s.
Okay.
You have Fliss, who is a military wife. Her husband's a doctor who's overseas in Korea. So she is an examination of what is, not only Korea, the Korean War and what the families went through, but also motherhood. What is it like to be basically a single mother during that experience and during the baby boom, which is the time when, the birth rate is exploding, yet it's also the time when the birth control pill is being, developed, and she gets involved a bit with that. We have another woman who's quite a bit older, who's a refugee from Berlin in the 1930s. What does that look like for someone whose life is still very much haunted by World War II? And what does it look like for the people who got out of that terrible point of history? But what did life look like for them now that they're in America? What does the American dream really look like for that? Then I have a woman who works on Capitol Hill as a secretary for Senator Margaret Chase Smith, who was the only senator who had the guts to stand up on the Senate floor and tell McCarthy that this is not what America should be about. This is not right, what you are doing. Everyone said if a man had given the speech that she gave that day, that man would have been the next president. And then you have another woman in the House who works for HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which is the very pro-McCarthy committee that is responsible for spearheading these witch hunts against American citizens for their private beliefs, which is very unconstitutional. So all the women have in their way, an examination of some different facet of American life during this time. And so that meant I was really diving deep into everything from, the Korean War to the Cold War to the study of, how TV is rising up and replacing radio, to what are people, eating and drinking and cooking in the kitchen. There's some very scary 50s food that I had to research. And, all the way to, the Women's World War II baseball leagues, from League of Their Own and so forth, which are finally winding down. So this book really did have a little bit of everything for me to research, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and that's why you're a master of telling stories, because you're weaving in all of these components, and we're reading it. And we talked about it many times on the show about how if we could only teach history this way, where we could tell it through story, because I think it would actually stick. It's like I'm relearning all of these American history as I go back and dive into historical fiction and historical novels and things I've forgotten because I just memorized it for the test back in school. So,
well, I do think that historical fiction is a great gateway drug to history. And ideally speaking, if people can learn something through a story, then they'll be interested to go dig up the real story on their own. The best historical fiction, I've always thought, really sends you on a rabbit hole hunt, down Google, to try to find out, was that real? Did that really happen? And I really do think a lot of it is because, a lot of us are taught history in a very boring way. It's all about, this law being passed and that tariff being passed and when did this battle take place and what date. And that can be a very boring way to learn history, because really history is fascinating, and history is about people who are every bit as much motivated by the same things as you and I are. I mean, it's like history is about people and their flaws and their foibles and how they struggle to do better and how they stumble and do worse. And that's what it's about, but that's not how it's taught. And I do think that more people would love history if they just dived into the human side.
Yeah,
But that's where
Absolutely.
historical fiction helps pick up the slack. So I'm glad that people, hopefully relearn, the hatred of history that they acquired in high school social studies when they pick up a historical novel and think, wow, this is really cool. I want to learn more.
You'll enjoy this, but we read The Diamond Eye for our book club in the
Oh,
fall,
lovely.
actually. And so many of the women, when we came back to meet for our meeting, was like, I went down the rabbit hole to find out more. So they were watching YouTube videos and all of these things after they read The Diamond Eye, because we were all just like fascinated about this piece of history that we had learned about. So you're doing exactly that, because our book club was a very great example of how multiple women had went down the rabbit hole before our meeting to continue to learn more about her
Oh, that's
story.
wonderful.
So, and I think when we can attach the human side of what you're saying to history, it allows us, I think, a lot to be like walk in someone else's shoes that we may never have been able to walk in, but realize, like you're saying, that we feel very similarly or have similar emotions. Or you can think about, how would I have behaved if I lived in that time period? And so we can learn and learn empathy, especially, I think, through reading these novels.
Well, I do think that empathy is something that is much easier to get a handle on when you're learning it through the lens of specific stories rather than this is what happened to
Yeah.
people as a whole, which is often the way history is taught. I mean, because it is a way to, I often think that historical fiction and science fiction are sister genres, because science fiction has always had a reputation for examining the issues of the present through the lens of the future. Isaac Asimov and all these golden age of sci-fi authors were talking about issues like segregation or racism, but they were talking about it through stories about aliens. And
Yeah.
the metaphor is not that complicated. These are that they were looking at the issues of the present through the issues of the through the lens of the future. But I think historical fiction has the power to do that, but look at the issues of the present through the lens of the past.
Yeah.
Because for example, in the Briar Club, it is a lot of it about the challenges that women are facing. You know, in this day and age, in the early 50s, they are facing things like whether they're going to be allowed to limit the size of their families, what kind of birth control is available to them, what kind of glass ceiling do they have to smash in order to be able to advance in the workplace. How are they going to be viewed if they are married but working, or single but working. There's all of these are issues that women are still facing today, but we
Yeah.
can look at it through the lens of like, oh, this is how they were dealing with it in the early 50s, and you can at that point have a chance to see like, well, what are we still facing that's exactly the same issue, or have we come further than that now? It does provoke the conversation, and I think that's another great use for historical fiction, is that it invites us to compare the past to the present in our own lives.
Yeah. And I often think that women were not really erased from history, but they just weren't talked about, right? Their stories were not told. And so it's almost like these untold stories that are bringing to life. I mean, I didn't know about this senator that stood up to McCarthy, and she was the only one to do so, and being female. And I'm like, wow, that seems like a fascinating piece of history I had no idea about.
It is one of those things that I think I'm very far from the only author who has this fascination with finding untold women's stories of the past, because you're completely correct. The spotlight of history does tend to focus on the winners, always does, and it does tend to focus on the doings of men, and mostly European white men or American white
Yeah.
men. And so when you want to look at for different stories, you have to dig around the edges of that spotlight to find them, but they are there. And these people have done amazing things that just didn't make it to the front and center spotlight of history in the way that the history books are written. That's one of those things where I am really fascinated with digging up and finding those stories and shining a bit more of a spotlight on them. And I'm not by any means the only author who does so. I have so many wonderful colleagues you know in my life who are fascinated with exactly the same thing, and we're all digging around and trying to find these women to highlight, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I imagine that having that community, other authors around you, that's kind of a catalyst to help one another, right? It's you're all working, not working together per se, but you have this community you can reach out to, and they understand exactly what you might be going through in writing and all of that.
Yeah, community is the best thing about being a writer, I really do have to say, is because it is a very solitary profession at a lot of times, and you're alone in your study with nothing but the voices in your head, and it is having those this group of women I've had at my back for so long, who I know I can reach out to, and, who can talk you off the ledge when you're thinking like, oh my God, this is the worst book yet written. And they'll be like, shut up. No, it's not. You're fine. You do this at every point in the stage. And it's like, really? I do? It's every time.
Yeah.
And it is wonderful to have someone to reach out to, like about copy editing, like the copy editing blues when they hit, or about the sheer nail biting nerve wrackingness of being on submission. It's like these are things that it's much easier to reach out and be able to commiserate with another writer about, because it's a very weird and very solitary profession.
I have found that about podcasting as well. That it's solitary, but if you find your community of people that understand, and you can call, like, phone a friend, like, hey, I need some help in here, or, like you said, just the mental side of it too, like talk me back into this. Like, so it's, I imagine not totally the same, but it's similar capacity. That community helps. And, being in a transient lifestyle, having a community is huge.
Oh, yes.
So, well, did you have a favorite character to write from the Briar Club?
Um, I really loved Grace the most. Grace is the character you meet on page 1, pretty much, who
Okay.
is the widow from Iowa, who has just come to the house and just moved into this, tiny attic room. And she's the one who has a real gift for community. Like from the beginning,
Okay.
she's pulling her neighbors around her into these supper clubs, these impromptu parties that she throws in her, placemat size apartment. And, she's feeding people and she's listening to their stories. And when you go through and, you see every woman in the house gets her own section sort of to tell her own story. And when you hear those stories, what you're going to see is that Grace is the person who can be relied on to show up with advice and with a drink and with a listening ear and to help. And she does that repeatedly for the people around her. But the thing is that you might also notice is that Grace does not share her own past and her own secrets at the same time as she is hearing everybody else's. She is, a little bit of a locked vault. She is a very friendly, very kind, very empathetic locked vault, but she is a vault. And so it's not until the very end that you will learn what Grace's secret is. And I had a lot of fun sort of weaving her into every single story as, as a mentor, as a friend, as, the voice of reason in a moment when a voice of reason was badly needed. She is always the voice of a community and the voice that you need, regardless of what you need. She has a real gift for that. But then, what is her secret? And so I really enjoyed writing her. She was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And I'm wondering, I have to go read it, but I'm wondering if the other characters are picking up that she's a locked vault as it goes along, and
they
if they
do
start questioning that. Okay.
They do, because after a while, it's one of those things where they realize, she's lived with us for 2 years, 3 years, almost 4 years now, and she doesn't have a single picture of a single family member, and she never talks about friends or like family from home. She never goes home to visit. She doesn't, like, she's a widow, but she never ever talked. Does anyone even know what her husband's name was? It's like, it's all these things where everybody realizes slowly and eventually that that she is very good at listening, but she is very good at turning the conversation away when it comes time for people to try to listen to her.
Okay. All right. So listeners, that's going to be something to kind of follow in the story there. Is there anything that you hope the readers would think about as they're reading the Briar Club, or any topics you'd hope they'd ponder?
Well, I really think that this is a book about the American dream in a lot of ways. It is, it's one that I wrote in part because, I feel like being an American is a complicated thing right now. How to take pride in our country without airbrushing away its mistakes. How to remember and acknowledge and honor our legacy, but not whitewash our past sins and problems. And I believe, in a warts and all approach, to the past. You need to look at the good alongside with the bad. Don't elevate the one above the other. Learn from both. The Briar Club is very much a book about what it is to be an American, which is something that, the last decade of political upheaval and social unrest has us all pondering with what feels like sometimes increasing desperation. So
yeah,
I hope
like a hopelessness sometimes.
yeah, really,
Yeah.
right. And I hope that if people read this book, they walk away with, a story that they've loved, full of women that they admire. And I hope that they have some food for thought about what it is to be part of this country and how we can be proud of it, but temper that pride with the knowledge of, where we've gone wrong and how we can do better in future.
Really excited, and I'm so excited for our listeners to be able to read it as well. I imagine that you've learned a ton about yourself through writing, but is there one thing that stands out that you've learned about yourself through doing it over the years?
It's a really interesting question. Well, I do think that, in a lot of ways, writers cannot choose what they're fascinated by. I just, it's one of those things that, I think I remember Stephen King saying something along the lines of, he like how many times he felt mildly ashamed for people who tried to shame him for writing horror. And he just said after a while, it's like, I can't bother to feel ashamed anymore about that. I just happen to have a love for the active graveyard and the unquiet coffin, and that's all there is to it. And I can't explain why. And I have a little bit of that too. It's like, I think the things that I have learned about my own books, writing them, is that I have a fascination with the way in which women of the past carve out spheres of influence and independence and power for themselves, even when they live in eras that don't particularly want them to have it. And you can find women like that in any era, which is why it's a common thread in every book that I've written, whether that book takes place in Renaissance Italy or first century imperial Rome or in, McCarthy's America. I'm fascinated by the way that women's lives and people's lives in general are changed by huge events like war. Will they get opportunities that they might not be able to have in peacetime? And then can they hang on to those opportunities once the war is over? And like finding the ways in which women manage to contribute to enormous world events, even though their contributions go unsung or are sidelined. And, since I am a Navy wife, I am very fascinated by the effect of war and military life on the human psyche, both men and women. The way in which living in a war zone or having to, be in the fight in some way changes people, and the way it will continue to change them once they're done and they're standing in the rubble and they're having to think about, how do I go on with my life in peace? These are, because I'm not only familiar and how PTSD changes people, and how, a life of being in or around combat changes people. And I'm fascinated by this because not only through my husband, but I know a lot of military, both men and women, through him, who have become my friends as well. And so that's something else that fascinates me. And I don't know why these things ended up being, the sort of like whistles that my books sort of tend to tune back to. I can't explain that. It's just that, we all have things that interest us, and those issues do tend to weave their way into our books. I do think that writing books often is a way for your brain to be working out some of its subconscious issues, because I remember I have had things before where I have struggled with the idea of identifying the theme of whatever the book is that I'm writing. And then I finish the first draft and I look at it again. And then I realize that my subconscious has been tap dancing all over this manuscript and bringing all the things that are currently bothering me in life, but just bringing them up through story and theme rather than, through like group therapy or journalism.
Yeah.
Or journaling. So, it's like, I do think that most writers, like, your subconscious will find a way to work on what it wants to work on through your stories, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and I could see how that would really help you process it, right? It's like, it's not so firsthand that it's your what you're processing. It's removed enough to another story, but it's really helping you work through it in your own brain. So I could see how that would be a fantastic process overall, and whether we want to call it a healing journey or whatever it is, helping you make sense of your own brain. So, well, after all the novels that you've written, do you have a favorite?
I don't have a favorite as much as I usually have a least favorite. And the least favorite is whichever one I'm currently working on that I am so tired of that I just wish it would like go away and die and I'd never have to see it again. And that's usually what the process is. And, but the nice thing about the way the process works is that I will have a chance to finish the book and then like send it off to my critique partners and my editor. And then it will come back to me, like a couple months later, or 6 weeks later, or whatever. And then I'll be rereading it and I'll think, this isn't so bad. Maybe it's not the worst thing ever written in the history of the published novel. It's like, it's got a few good parts here. And okay, maybe I don't hate it quite so much after that. And then by the time I'm done with all those edits and then, it goes away and then it's going to come back to me in a nice, beautiful bound form, I look at it and I'm like, oh, I guess I love it after all. And then, it becomes like all my children, and I love all my children, and it's on the shelf, and I'm very proud of it. But there's always a stage that I hit where I hate the book, and
Yeah.
I just want it. I would like to throw it on a fire and never speak of it again.
Yeah. And then you fall back in love with it.
And then I fall back in love with it later. But so that happens with every book.
Is there, even at this point in your career, I imagine, because I think of books as babies too, like you're releasing this out into the world, will you be nervous come release day for the Briar Club? Like, do you still have a bit of that?
Oh, I'm always nervous. I'm always nervous because I think, unlike, with a lot of other different creative processes, there's no big fanfare, necessarily for a book because, like when there's an album, people can listen to it and be done listening to
Sure.
it in an hour, and
Yeah.
have reactions to it. Like if there's a movie, people are going to it and binging it and streaming it, and then there's reactions to it. But with a book, it's going to take a while for people to read, even if they buy it the first day, and you're going to have to wait a little bit for those reactions to come and bite your nails about it. So I am always nervous. I am always
Okay.
worried. There's always that fear of like, this is going to be the book that flops so horribly that I will have to give up this job that I love, and I will have to become a dog walker and play to my strengths because at least dogs love me. And,
Yeah.
there's always that fear. And that's, again, where you call your community, and ideally speaking, if you don't have any event that is going to be taking up your time or book tour or whatever, which quite often you don't, depending on how things are going, you get some writer friends to like take you to lunch, and they
Oh
confiscate
yeah.
your phone,
Yep.
and they are authorized to use any method up to and including handcuffs to stop you from hitting refresh on your Amazon sales ranking.
Yeah. A pleasant distraction, it
Oh
sounds like.
yes. Oh yes. Much needed.
Absolutely. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about who you are as a reader and what genres do you enjoy reading?
Oh, I am a very wide reader. I will read in almost any genre there is, as long
Okay.
as it has a good story and good characters and good writing. And I'm a very much a mood reader. It's like I love a certain book at a certain time, and it has to be something I'm in the mood for. So sometimes if I try a book, I'll just think, this isn't the book for me right now, but I think I may like it later.
Yeah.
So I'm a mood reader, so it's like if I'm feeling like something light and fun, and they'll bring a big smile to my face. And Abby Jimenez, I just read her latest
Yeah.
that came out. If I'm feeling like something, dense and literary and historical, I might pick up a Maggie O'Farrell. If I am reading, if I'm feeling like a sci-fi, I'll go to Lois McMaster Bujold and read like some rousing space opera. Right now, I'm
Okay.
reading. I'm in a fantasy mood right now, so I'm reading N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy. It's like I love a good historical romance. I binge Bridgerton with everybody, so Julia Quinn and a Beverly Jenkins will really hit the spot when I want a historical romance. So it's like I will really read almost anything. It depends what I'm in the mood for, and it
Yeah.
depends what I'm feeling when I have it. But I do love to read. I read a lot, and it is. I do think too that reading very much primes the pump for writers.
Yeah.
It's filling that well of inspiration, and I've gotten amazingly good, like in flashes of inspiration from books that had nothing to do with the book that I'm writing, but
Yeah.
it might be in a completely different genre, but I'll read something that gives me some flash of insight into what I'm currently working on, and I'm like, yes, this is perfect. This just solved a problem for me. So that's one of the things that reading does, and I make sure I read
Yeah.
every day.
I love that. How in your busyness do you find time to read?
Well, I have no children, and I have no other hobbies really besides writing and reading, and other than that, walking the dogs and so forth. So that is one of the things that I really end up carving out a lot of time for.
Yeah. Okay. And then for part of the show is we have a book flight come on, which are three books that have influenced you or impacted you or three of your favorites. Can you tell us three of your favorite books?
Well, three of the ones that really got me into historical fiction as a kid. So these are, older authors, but these are ones that I still reread to this day.
Okay.
Um, Eva Ibbotson's The Oracle Glass, which is about a resourceful young woman who's making her way as a total fraud society fortune teller in the court of Louis XIV and the Sun King. And it taught me that, historical fiction could have a little touch of magic in it. It could be funny. It could have a great amount of, laughs, as well as a really dense, beautiful, thorough world building. And I love that because, historical fiction can sometimes be a deadly serious genre. And The Oracle Glass by Judith Merkel Riley showed me that it did not have to be.
Okay.
And then there's a wonderful novel called Medinsky Square by Eva Ibbotson. Eva Ibbotson is one of my top of all time. And it is just a slice of life in the life of a Viennese dressmaker pre-World War I in Vienna, in like the dying imperial age. And it is just so beautifully written in terms of the language and in terms of the wonderful things she does with character. I just, tear up whenever I read it. I love her books. And then I would also say, too, that there's a great book called Jubilee Trail about the founding of California, a pre-gold rush as a state.
Okay.
And it's Jubilee Trail by Gwen Bristow. And I love this book because she flipped the script from what I was used to as a little girl. And she didn't have the book end with a marriage. She had the book start with a marriage. That showed me more than anything that, life does not end at the altar for women, which is what you might think that it does if all you're going off of is like princess stories, which so often end with the wedding or the kiss. And this started with a woman's life. A woman's life begins when she marries a traitor and ends up going on this fantastic adventure, and she learns so much about herself, and she learns so much about her husband, and she learns so much about friendship, because she makes this wonderful friend who is with her through thick and thin, through all these adventures she has. And it showed me that, story could be told in a different way than just, there's the girl and there's the adventure, and then there's the kiss and the wedding at the end. And that was a totally new way for me to think about a book. I was only about 11 years old, and it changed things for me. And I still go back and read that book. It's a wonderful story of, like a coming of age, and a story of a marriage, and also the story of friendship. And it's also a great adventure at the same time, and a great bit of history that was so fascinating and yet not as well known. So those are 3 books that I love.
Yeah. And I've never heard of any of these. So I'm so excited. I'm like, this is what I love about this show, is it introduces me to so many new books that I can go pick up. So thank you for sharing those with us. The last thing I love to do to end our show is called our bonus pairings, and they're just a speed round of questions. So you can answer these really quick. And you've already kind of answered this one, but it sounds like you are a rereader.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then what is one book you've read that has changed your life? What is a book that made you want to become a writer?
Bernard Cornwell's King Arthur trilogy made me sob and made me absolutely want to be a writer. If I could write something that would also make people sob.
Okay. Where is your favorite place to read?
My favorite place to read is on my couch in front of a Boston Red Sox game, ideally where they're winning, with a glass of wine next to me and my dogs curled up around me.
I love it. That's like the perfect picture there. All right. And then last question here. What are you reading next?
What am I reading next? Well, I am in the middle of N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy. So I'm going to be going on to The Stone Sky as soon as I'm done with book 2 in the series, which totally has me locked and gripped right now. And I'm reading some great books for ARCs at the moment, and which means I'm going to be reading them for cover quotes. Greer McAllister's The 13th Husband, and is also one that I've got on my list. I can't wait to dive into that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show with us today. I know your time is precious, and I appreciate all you've given me.
No, absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for some great questions.
You are welcome. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Kate Quinn and her book flight of books that introduced her to historical fiction as a kid. We'd love to hear what other books you'd pair with this book flight at bookishflights.com. Bookish Flights has been nominated for the People's Choice Podcast Awards in the category of Best Female Hosted Podcast. If you can head on over to www.podcastawards.com and vote for Bookish Flights in the Best Female Hosted Podcast categories, we would greatly appreciate it. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.